And hello, everybody. I want to thank Jim for inviting me, if you can hear me. And am I being heard by everybody?
Yes.
Okay, I'll get going then. And hello, Long Island, and hello to everybody else who is not from Long Island who's tuning in tonight. My name is Evan Weiner, and I've been around baseball. I was around baseball, as you could see, because I was with the guy who was most quoted in Supreme Court arguments. That's a 2006 picture of Yogi Berra. And I used to speak regularly at Yogi's Museum in Upper Montclair, New Jersey, at Montclair State University. I'm going to give you a little background on me. I've been in this racket since I'm 15 years old, 1971. I was at Spring Valley High School, Spring Valley, New York, in Rockland County. I was in 11th grade, and I had a teacher by the name of Joe Dionisio. And Joe Dionisio never knew any student's name, but he would point to all of us, student, 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 and he points to me and he says, "You got a good voice. How would you like to be in radio?" And I said, "I'd love to be in radio," in the worst way. And I was. It was a show called Tiger Talk on WRKL radio every Tuesday afternoon at 3:45. It was a 15-minute show about Spring Valley High School. And that was opening the door. Joe opened the door for me for radio and also for newspapers, because I was a stringer for the Nyack, New York Journal News, along with the Bergen County Hackensack Record, the Bergen Record owned by the Borg family. And I had three incarnations at the Bergen Record. One as a high school stringer, one doing feature pieces in the late 1970s, and then coming back writing op-ed pieces in the year 2003, 2004, 2005. About 6 years after that, I was at WGRC Radio in Nanuet, New York. A guy by the name of Steve North from Roslyn hired me, said, "You got to work on Saturdays." I was 21 years old, a year out of college, because I was out of college early. And it was a good thing, because Rockland Community College had the speaker series, and I had to interview Ralph Nader and Julian Bond. But in March of 1978, Steve said, it was Saturday afternoon in March, you have to go cover the New York State Democratic fundraiser at the Tappan Zee Townhouse. And don't worry about getting any stories, because we'll use it on Monday morning. And I said, fine. So I walk in there, and it's a who's who. The first guy I saw was Gerald Nadler, who was an assemblyman from New York City at that point, and Patrick Daniel Moynihan, who was running for Senate, Hugh Carey running for governor, Mario Cuomo and his little kid, Andrew Cuomo at the time. He wasn't that little at the time. He was about 18. But then walked in this tall guy with sandy blonde hair, and he was really good looking, angular features, and I knew him because I watched Batman, and he was Mayor Linseed of Gotham City. And he comes up to me, doesn't introduce himself to me, he comes up to me and he says, "I like you." We haven't even been introduced. He said, "I'm going to tell you something." "Go ahead, tell me." He said, "I'm running for Senate, state of New York. I was going to announce it next week, but you look like a good guy." And I was 21 with a big bushy afro and a mustache at that point. I looked more like Alex Trebek at that point. And he gave me the story. I run back to WGRC. Don't even tell Steve I got the scoop. Call up AP, call up UPI with my scoop. And I get a call from Henry Marcotte, WNEW Radio. And he said, "Can we get that story from you?" I said, "Yeah, how much are you going to pay me?" He said, $10. I said, "Sold." And for 3 years, I was with WNEW doing stringing work. That's Yogi Berra. And Yogi, of course, everybody knew him in the 1950s. Everybody knew him in the 1960s. Not only was he a baseball catcher, but he also was a pitchman. And baseball was so ingrained in the American conscience in the 1950s and the 1960s. There was the French philosopher by the name of Jacques Barzun. And in 1954, Barzun wrote, "Whoever wants to know the heart and mind of America had better learn baseball." And he had a suggestion too: don't go to major league games. Go to see a high school game, or go to, they still had industry teams in those days, go to the industry teams, learn the game. And over the years that I had done this talk, I've met people who were immigrants. A guy from Italy came over in the 1930s, and he said he no English. He was 17 years old, but he said that he knew he had to like baseball to get friends and also to assimilate into the culture. And he said he learned how to speak English by watching baseball. Perhaps Barzan was right. And perhaps he was right. It had been ingrained in the culture for so long. You might know this character. I certainly did, because at PS 151 in Queens in 1964, I had a teacher by the name of Miss Alexander. Now, Miss Alexander must have been 132 years old at the time. She had the blue hair, she had the white blouse, and she had the, not only the white blouse, but she had the blue skirt, and here, tucked in here, were napkins. So in case her nose ran, she would go like that. But anyway, she gives us an assignment, and the assignment is pretty simple. Analyze Casey at the bat. So I'm 8 years old. You know, I know the story. There's no joy in Mudville, for the mighty Casey had struck out. And I said, he was a lousy baseball player. That's all he was. He struck out with the bases loaded in the bottom of the ninth, just like Ron Swoboda used to do, except Swoboda came with the bets a bit later. Anyway, he struck out. And I said to Miss Alexander, lousy baseball player. Oh, no. That's wasn't what it was about. Wasn't about at all. All about man's failures. Was it about man's failures? Yes or no? Well, Ernest Thayer was a columnist with the San Francisco Examiner between 1886 and 1888. I wrote some ed pieces for the San Francisco Examiner. That's the only thing Ernest Thayer and I had in common, and we did it in different centuries. He did it in the 19th century. I did it in the 21st century, in the early days of the 21st century. He writes this story. It's printed June 3rd, 1888. No author's credit. Take me out to the ball game. I'm not sure if Thayer liked it or didn't like it, or it was a throwaway piece, but it's in the San Francisco Examiner. But he never takes credit for it. Doesn't at least take credit for it till 7 years later. 7 years later, Casey at the bat is totally ingrained in the American culture. Now, that's Heather Hopper's father, DeWolf Hopper, and he picks up the poem about 2 months after it's printed in the San Francisco Examiner. It becomes part of a vaudeville act on August 14th, 1888. It's estimated that Hopper performed the poem more than 10,000 times. 10,000 times. That is me. That's the Springfield Library, Springfield, New Jersey. And I speak at the Springfield Library, and normally I wouldn't bring that up, except if you're looking at me, look at the thing I'm pointing to. That is a cylinder, and that's a player for a cylinder from the 1890s. There was this guy who lived in Springfield who was kind of a strange guy who collected all kinds of things, lived by himself. He passed away, and he had all these strange things, which are on display now at the Springfield Library in New Jersey, including that, a cylinder. And the librarian, or actually the library director, said, "You want to hear it? Because this still plays." And she did, and she played it. Now, chances are, if you were around in the 1890s, the first time you heard the spoken voice of somebody doing "Take Me Out to the Ball Game" was on that piece of machinery. And it was done by this guy, Russell Hunter, Russell Hunter. He was an entertainer and early sound recordist. He recorded it first in 1893, then again in 1898. Both times, it was a heavy Irish brogue. 1905, John Kaiser recorded it for Edison. Hopper's version, he finally records one for Victor, but that does not come out until 1906. But hunting, he was the first guy. And if you wanted to listen to it at home, you needed that kind of recorder, which now you can find in the Springfield Library. And also, you could hear Hopper's rendition on that thing that you see, that record player, that a guy has it in his garage in Sagway, Quebec. I speak on cruise ships. We stayed there, or we stopped there last year, and I went into this guy's place, and it was an amazing place of old junk. And he had one of those, and that still works. So chances are, if you were around in 1906, 1907, 1908, you too could hear Heather Hopper's father, DeWolf Hopper, on one of those. Hopper would be the first to commit the verse to film in 1922 in a short subject by Lee DeForest. Wallace Beery did a film version of that, 1927. The comic Jerry Colonna, who was Bob Hope's second banana, recorded a rendition for Disney, which later provided the basis for a 1946 cartoon. Jackie Gleason performed it on his TV show in the 1950s. Tug McGraw, Johnny Bench, George Steinbrenner, Billy Martin also voiced the poem often in orchestral settings. Now, take a look at that sign. Now, if I was in person with you, I would go around the room, and maybe we could do that if Jim wants to feed me any questions, and ask, does that sign have any kind of significance? Yes or no? I'll just wait a second if there's anybody who has anything to say, because that sign was in the New York subway, going from downtown Manhattan to uptown Manhattan. Ball game today at the Polo Grounds. And there were two writers, well, actually one writer by the name of Jack Norwith, who saw the sign and came up with an idea for a baseball song. The song that we all know is now going to be performed by my wife before she runs down to dinner. Anyway, it's my wife, Brenda.
Take me out to the ball game. Take me out to the crowd. Buy me some peanuts and Cracker Jacks. I don't care if I never get back, 'cause it's root for the home team. If they don't win, it's a shame, 'cause it's 1, 2, 3 strikes, you're out at the old ball game.
Take Me Out to the Ball Game. Take Me Out to the Ball Game could have been the first feminist song ever written. Now, the background of the Take Me Out to the Ball Game is pretty simple. Norwith decides, and there's Harry Carey, which you don't see with Harry Carey there, is his 6 best friends named Bud, because Harry Carey, the Chicago Cubs announcer, used to do the Take Me Out to the Ball Game in between the top of the 7th and the bottom of the 7th inning, always off key, always poor. And the Cubs, since Harry's passing, have continued the tradition of Take Me Out to the Ball Game in the 7th inning. Now, let's talk about Take Me Out to the Ball Game. Maybe the first women's lib song ever written inadvertently. The song was written by Jack Norwith and Albert von Tilzer. They never saw a baseball game in 1908, 1909, 1910, 1911. In fact, Norwith didn't go to a baseball game until 1928, von Tilzer until 1940. The song would become famous on the vaudeville stage. It was sung by Norwith's wife, Nora Bayes. She popularized it along the vaudeville tour, vaudeville circuit, along with Shine On Harvest Moon. Song written in 1908. Here it is, 2020. Although we have a very strange situation this year. No baseball's being played, so the song's not being played. But it is the only song I could guarantee you written in 1908 under normal circumstances that is played every day from late February through October in the United States and parts of Canada. The only song from back in those days. Shine On Harvest Moon is still out there here and there, but how many people sing Shine On Harvest Moon? Yet, Take Me Out to the Ball Game is still being played 112 years later. Take Me Out to the Ball Game was in movies with Groucho Marx, but I want to talk before Groucho about Take Me Out to the Ball Game and what it's all about. You probably don't know, there are 3 verses to Take Me Out to the Ball Game. Verse 1 is this woman, Katie Casey. Katie Casey is with her unnamed beau. We don't know too much about this guy. Women didn't go to baseball games in those days, which is why it could be the first women's lib song. And listen to the main stanza that you listen to with my wife singing and sing, you may understand why it might have been the first women's lib song. Katie Casey and her beau are on the subway, and it's afternoon because games started at 3 o'clock, and we don't know what time of year it was, but we do know that Katie Casey has this date, boyfriend, friend, husband, we don't know. And they're deciding what to do. What are we supposed to do today? And Katie Casey and her boyfriend are going back and forth because she wants to go to a baseball game. The boyfriend doesn't want to. Now, back in 1908, women weren't considered polite women going to baseball games. Gentlemen went there, but women generally didn't go there. And so in this sense, Katie Casey is fighting for what she wants. And they're going back and forth. Finally, she can't take it anymore. And she breaks into, take me out to the ball game, take me out to the crowd, buy me some peanuts and Cracker Jacks. I don't care if I'll ever get back, for we will root, root, root for the home team. If they don't win, it's a shame. Or it's 1, 2, 3 strikes, you're out at the old ball game. We don't know whether or not Katie Casey and her beau ever went to the game. In fact, we don't even know if they lasted the afternoon. But Katie Casey had that baseball fever really bad, really, really bad. And she knew all the players. Players didn't wear numbers or names on the back of their jerseys, but she somehow knew all of them. And she knew how to get them going. I don't know if it's the same getting them going as Bull Durham in 1988 with Susan Sarandon and Kevin Costner and that's the whole thing, which Max Packin, who was the clown prince of baseball, also appeared and once told me, he said, I didn't get the girl, as always, in there. But anyway, we don't know what happened, but Katie Casey had the baseball bug really bad. Groucho Marx, 1936, Night at the Opera. And for those of you who don't know the background about Night at the Opera, Groucho goes over to Italy looking for the world's greatest tenor and finds Alan Jones, Jack Jones' father, who wasn't the world's greatest tenor, but he thinks it is. He's supposed to bring it back to the opera company that he manages for Margaret Dumont. And the guy, the tenor that Margaret Dumont wants is there. They have to knock him out, dress up the guy who's taking his place. And in the middle, Chico and Harpo get some sheet music and hand it to the people in the orchestra. And they go from the opening aria to Take Me Out to the Ball Game. Groucho jumps down from his box, complete with Cracker Jacks and peanuts, and starts throwing it at the orchestra. That was in the culture at that point. Harpo Marx returned to the song on I Love Lucy in 1955. It's been in numerous movies and in numerous television shows. And like I said, in 2020, it's the only song that's 112 years old that is played regularly under normal circumstances. Normal circumstances. We don't have the normal circumstances, of course, this year. You might know these two guys. The guy on the left is Bud Abbott. The guy on the right is Lou Costello. And they're doing a famous routine called Who's On First. It's an old vaudeville routine called Rounders. Rounders was very popular in the 1920s and in the 1930s on the vaudeville circuit and on the burlesque circuit. Now, there were two burlesque circuits. One of them, if the word ended in Q-U-E, it was generally for the entire family. They could come and see, the girls would dance around, and you would have comics. The other, with a K in burlesque to end the word, would be the women took off their clothes, you'd have the comics and all that. So the difference in the two burlesques was pretty simple. If it was a K, the clothes came off. Q-U-E, at the end of the word, the clothes stayed on. Abbott and Costello met on the burlesque circuit in the 1930s. It has been suggested that Bud Abbott did something about baseball as part of a Rounders routine. Now, baseball probably came out of a game called Rounders that was played in England in the 1700s. Which makes this kind of interesting as well. Now, I go up to the Berkshires every summer, speak up at the Berkshires, Hopefully we'll be able to do that this year. There's a museum in North Adams, Massachusetts, near the Vermont border. And it's a baseball museum, and they claim that baseball was played in the Pittsfield area in the 1790s, long before, allegedly, Abner Doubleday founded baseball in 1839 in Cooperstown, New York. A story backed up by a guy who's drunk, Abner Graves, who said he saw it in 1939 as a 5-year-old, and they dug him up in the early part of the 20th century to say, yeah, I saw Abner Doubleday, because baseball obviously needed some starting point. That was the starting point. Abbott and Costello, their starting point was in the 1930s. It was an American classic. It was a vaudeville act that was quite common in those days, where you had the straight man and the stooge, and the straight man would just sit there and drive the stooge crazy, and the stooge would ask all kinds of questions, never get a straight answer, and couldn't deal with not getting a straight answer. Now here's the question. Did Abbott and Costello pay Michael Musto $15 for the routine? Now, as I said, I speak on cruise ships, and I have quite a few friends who are comics who work on cruise ships. One guy by the name of John Joseph, who was doing who's on first bit with his partner Johnny B on the ship that I was on, except it was a musical Who's on First. And he said, of course, they paid Musto $15 for the routine. Max Docelli, my other friend, Max said to me, no, we steal everything. We steal everything. Of course, we didn't get paid for that routine. Anyway, so we don't know. In fact, we don't even know whether or not Mike Musto wrote the routine. There are other people who claim that they wrote the routine, but it fell into the hands of Abbott and Costello. And it took them about 2 years to work out the routine. They premiered the routine on the Kate Smith Show. Kate Smith Show was on CBS at the time, radio, in March of 1938. They may have gotten some help writing the routine from two guys. John Grant, who was Costello's writer. In fact, Costello would fire John Grant during the blacklisting days in the 1950s because Costello thought that John Grant was a communist. And then when Costello and Abbott split, and the routine by Costello is falling flat, he brings back John Grant and another guy by the name of Will Glickman. The routine works. It's a smash. It's on the Kate Smith Show, which is highly popular on CBS in 1938, and they're on their way. Abbott and Costello were players on the Kate Smith Show back in 1938. From there, they do the routine. They end up with the Niagara Falls routine. They end up going into movies, and they go into TV, and they play the White House many, many times for Franklin Roosevelt, for Harry Truman, for Dwight Eisenhower, doing the same routine, Who's on First. So it's performed at the White House, performed in movies, radio, and TV. And in 1956, Abbott and Costello were enshrined in baseball's Hall of Fame. They are the first non-baseball people to get an honor at the Cooperstown Shrine. In around 2008, the Los Angeles Dodgers have a Korean player, and Vin Scully is looking at his monitor, and he's looking at that picture. And Vin Scully, in his style that nobody else had, the former Brooklyn Dodgers announcer, who went out to Los Angeles in 1958 when Walter O'Malley, hope I'm not offending anybody mentioning O'Malley, if anybody here is from Brooklyn, moved the Brooklyn Dodgers to Los Angeles. And Vin is looking at the screen and he says, now we know the answer to the eternal question of who's on first. There he is. Who from South Korea is on first base after getting on base for the Los Angeles Dodgers. Prior to this routine, the Washington Senators in the 1920s had a second baseman by the name of Watt. So we know who's on first, Watt's on second, and don't know anybody else. A couple years ago, my wife and I went up to Hyde Park. And I had some questions for President Franklin Roosevelt. I do talks, and I do a talk on the 1936 Olympics, and I wanted to know why Franklin Roosevelt did not stop the American team from going to the Berlin Olympics, the Summer Olympics, the Hitler Olympics. Franklin Roosevelt was a great host. He and Eleanor, just look at them. They were great hosts. To me and my wife, they were a little stiff, just a little stiff. And they suggested read the book. Couldn't read the book because that was stiff. So I asked Roosevelt, next question. I said, you were the first guy in the United States on TV. Stage fright? Nah, not with him. He did the fireside chats. He knew how to use media. But the main purpose of this thing, and I do a talk on the early days of TV, back in 1939, the first television sets were in the New York area, 400 of them. And Roosevelt appeared at the New York World's Fair, April 30th, 1939, and was the first to be seen on RCA TV. The other one, 1941, Pearl Harbor is bombed, December 7th, 1941. And soon afterwards, Franklin Roosevelt gets a letter from this guy, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, who wants to know, should baseball go on? Kind of apropos today, because baseball is trying to figure out how to go on during this pandemic. And back in 1918 and 1919, baseball did go on in the pandemic, and there are pictures of batters having masks and pitchers having masks and catchers having masks under their masks as they played. During World War I in 1918, the National League owners wanted to play a full season. The American League owners didn't. They came to a compromise which ended the season in early September basically because of World War I, not the flu. And the Boston Red Sox would win the World Series in 1918. So Landis has a question: how do we proceed? And this is what Roosevelt said: I honestly feel that it would be best for the country to keep baseball going. Baseball provides a recreation that does not last over 2 hours or 2.5. Obviously, Franklin Roosevelt didn't go to baseball in the 21st century, which can be gotten for very little cost. Now, Roosevelt could afford it, but obviously he didn't go to a baseball game in the 21st century. And incidentally, I hope that night games could be extended because it gives an opportunity to the day shift to see a game occasionally. With that, Roosevelt gave baseball the okay to play during World War II. Hank Greenberg was the first player to sign up for the war, enlisting in the Army on December 8th, 1941, and a good many baseball players ended up in the Army. In 1917, when we went to war, the United States went to war, baseball was not considered an essential job, and players were told either you join the Army or you join some program helping out at stateside. Hank Gowdy was the first player, catcher with the Boston Braves, to end up with the U.S. Army. He enlisted. That's Babe Ruth, of course, a very young Babe Ruth. As we segue into movies, Babe Ruth made 10 movies in his career. And you can look at the very young Babe, who was in shape back in those days. He made 10 movies, but he was not the first baseball player ever to appear in the movie. But his movies included the 1920 silent film, Heading Home, which starred Babe, typecasting, baseball player. He starred in Babe Comes Home. That's a 1927 silent movie. The prints just dissolved the way film was made in those days. If you didn't preserve it then and there, chances are it wasn't going to survive. He appeared in a movie that did survive, Speedy, which was done in 1928, the Harold Lloyd silent movie where he hangs from a clock, if you might remember that scene. It's a great scene, hanging from a clock. And Babe played himself. Overall, Babe was in 10 movies. But he wasn't the first. The first was a New York Giants second baseman, and he was Mike Donlin. And when I give this talk, nobody knows who Mike Donlin was in his day. And he was a pretty good baseball player back in his day. He played with the New York Giants. He was known as the baseball idol of Manhattan. Mike Donlin was a career 333 hitter. So he was a pretty good player. During the dead ball era. He took multiple breaks from the game to perform on stage and in vaudeville. He retired for good to go to the movies in 1914, went right into the movies. And his first movie afterwards, called Right Off the Bat, that featured his New York Giants manager, John J. McGraw. It is thought that Donlin made at least 53 appearances in silent movies back in the day. He was also on Broadway at the time as well. And that is not Gary Cooper. No, 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 no. That is Lou Gehrig. Lou Gehrig did a movie called Rawhide, which will never be confused with the show Rawhide, which I believe Clint Eastwood was in back in the day. Anyway, the basic premise of the is Gehrig by 1938 is fed up with his fame, fed up playing baseball, playing all those games, needs a break. So he and his sister buy a piece of land in Montana. They're going to become ranchers, leave New York, which is kind of odd because he was a New York guy, grew up in New York, went to Columbia University and all, played with the Yankees. Anyway, he's going to leave that all behind, settle quiet life in Montana. The movie Rawhide. So he has a news conference, allegedly. You know, the news conference is shot at Grand Central Terminal, announces he's retiring from baseball, buys the ranch, goes out there with his sister where they both can relax in solitude. End of movie. Movie's totally forgotten, except for one thing. 1939, Lou Gehrig is diagnosed with the disease ALS, which is named after him. And the doctors decide to go back to look at the movie, which was shot in 1938, to give them some sort of references to, because there were very, I mean, there was the Foxtone films, but they didn't really have what you needed to watch Lou Gehrig. And they could look at Lou Gehrig and look at his movements and then look at some of his movements in 1939. And they were able to at least get a peek into people who might have had this disease and how rapidly it infects the body. So for nothing else, this movie was used by the medical profession to gain a little understanding about the Lou Gehrig disease, as it was called, or ALS. By the way, the Yankee stars Babe Ruth. Babe Ruth had throat cancer at the end. And he was in the hospital in New York, and they wanted to give him this experimental treatment. It was called chemotherapy. And he was one of the first to get chemotherapy. It helped him out initially. And Babe Ruth might have done more for humanity by trying the chemotherapy than hitting 714 home runs. Here's my all-time idol. And my wife's not here, but if you ask her, she'll tell you that everything that I happen to learn in life came from Bugs Bunny and Warner Brothers cartoons. And it was a happy 83rd birthday to Daffy Duck the other day, who was 83 years old. He took on the Gas House Gorillas in the cartoon, beat them too, almost single-handedly. So he beats the Gas House Gorillas. Among the films that you might remember, League of Their Own, the technical advisor on that was a guy by the name of Casey Kendall, who played with the Montreal Expos in the 1990s. And I got to talk to Casey one day, going back to my days when I was covering sports, and I asked him about it, and he was telling me that his mother actually played for the Phil Wrigley teams in the Women's League, which went from the beginning of World War II to about 1950. Jimmy Fox was the manager. Tom Hanks played Jimmy Fox, or the Jimmy Fox character in the movie. No crying in baseball. There's Madonna, there's Rosie O'Donnell, and Gina Davis behind there. Baseball and the movies have a very, very long history, going back to Babe Ruth and Mike Donlin. That is Gary Cooper, not Lou Gehrig. That is Gary Cooper, pride of the Yankees. Gary Cooper was right-handed, so all of the hitting and all of the fielding that was done, he never played baseball, was done with a mirror and was shot into a mirror, and that's why he was able to mimic Lou Gehrig. Of course, Kevin Costner in Bull Durham, along Susan Sarandon, Max Pankin, and others. That is Jerry Lewis standing on the baseline, and that is the Geisha Boy movie, the Los Angeles Dodgers. The Dodgers embraced in Hollywood when they got there, and he is talking to Pee Wee Reese over there directing that movie, which featured the Dodgers in the Los Angeles Coliseum. Robert Redford, The Natural. There's Kevin Costner again, The Field of Dreams, and there was supposed to be a game on that cornfield between the Chicago White Sox and the Yankees in Iowa this year. More than likely, we're not going to see that game. That game will be pushed back to 2021 if there's a cure, if there's a vaccine, or if the spread is mitigated to the point where it is quote unquote manageable. Billy Beane, played there by Brad Pitt. Billy Beane will tell you he is the smartest guy in baseball. He went to Stanford. Moneyball is the movie, of course, over there. And Walter Matthau, one of my favorites of all time. Walter Matthau never did anything bad. And he and Jack Lemmon always did the same role when they were together, whether it was The Fortune Cookie, whether it was The Odd Couple, or Grumpy Old Men. This, of course, The Bad News Bears and the Chico bail bonds. Walter Matthau, one of the last of the Yiddish theater actors. Walter Matthau never did anything bad. And Major League, Charlie Sheen in that movie with Bob Uecker, among others. Major League 2, that one. Pride of the Yankees, Bull Durham. Major League, Angels in the Outfield. That was done in Forbes Field in Pittsburgh. And why? Because Bing Crosby was the minority owner of the Pittsburgh Pirates, and he said, use my ballpark. Bob Hope was the minority partner with Cleveland Indians, his hometown. Danny Kaye in 1977, Danny Kaminsky, Danny Kaye was part owner of the Seattle Mariners expansion team, 1977. Fields of Dreams, Geisha Boy, Bad News Bears, The Natural, Moneyball, among the movies that were made. Baseball. Now, I got a question for you that you can answer later, and I can ask you right now, and before I get to that slide, you can answer it. Is Homer Simpson in baseball's Hall of Fame? Springfield Isotopes win the championship against Major League players, softball. There's Homer, who scored the winning run, and there is Mr. Burns in there, and a whole bunch of others of the Simpsons cast. Mr. Ed, Los Angeles Dodgers tried to sign Mr. Ed, and there is Wilbur, Alan Post, and of course Sandy Koufax from Brooklyn, New York. Sanford Braun, his name, and his mother got divorced, and he took Koufax as his name legally after that. Mr. Ed tried out for the Los Angeles Dodgers. So did Herman Munster, Fred Gwynn, standing next to Leo Durocher on the Munsters. And if you might remember the Munsters, it was pretty simple. They were the all-American family, even though Herman was 7'6" and weighed 540 pounds. He's playing in a park near his house, just playing with Eddie Wolfgang Munster, and Herman's just hitting balls to him, and Eddie's catching, and lo and behold, Leo Durocher, the third base coach of the Los Angeles Dodgers, comes running out, happens to have a contract in his hand, and he offers the contract, piece of paper, the contract to Herman Munster. And Herman tries out for the Dodgers, but being that he's 7'6", he's a little bit of a liability on the field. He can hit, but he's wiping out players on the field. Ultimately, the Dodgers release him. But come fall, he's back in the park, and he's kicking footballs to Eddie Munster, his son Eddie. And lo and behold, out of the bushes where Leo came out, and this is something about Leo. Leo is never up in the morning. You know, here's a night bird. He enjoyed the nightlife. But anyway, Elroy Crazy Legs Hirsch, the general manager of the Los Angeles Dodgers, comes out of the bushes. And he's about ready to sign Herman. And all of a sudden, Leo pops out. Don't do it, Elroy. Don't do it. You'll be sorry. Baseball, embraced by television. And there is Gilligan. I never understood is how many people went through that island and knew that there were castaways and never told anybody that the castaways were alive. Anyway, in that picture, on the left side is Al Ferrara, who once said when he was the Los Angeles Dodgers, he knew he had made it in baseball because he had his face on the baseball card. To the right is Frenchie Lefevre, Jim Lefevre, who told me all about that episode. And Jim tried to get into acting in the 1960s. He ended up becoming a baseball manager. And there is Gilligan, Willie Gilligan, who is being cooked by the headhunters in that particular episode. Harlem Globetrotters also visited Gilligan's Island. Johnny Roseboro, the Los Angeles Dodgers catcher. He was in demand in the 1960s on TV shows. The Dodger owner, Walter O'Malley, appeared with a Rifleman star and a fellow Dodger, the former Brooklyn Dodgers first baseman, the actor Chuck Connors in Brandon in 1965. Wes Parker, who played with the Dodgers in the late 60s, first base into the early 70s, also tried to become an actor. Willie Davis acted in The Love Machine, Jerry Lewis's Which Way to the Front, and The Flying Nun. John Roseborough, just the facts, bum, 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 bum. He appeared in Dragnet, the second incarnation of Dragnet, in color with Harry Morgan, which had the famous Blue Boy episode. Burke's Law, Kraft Suspense Theater, Mr. Ed, and Experiment in Terror. The Dodgers were in demand in LA. And usually when I'm in a crowd, particularly with baseball fans, I would ask the question, who's that guy with Phil Silvers? Obviously, you're not going to be able to respond because it's me talking. The guy on the right is Steve Bilko. Steve Bilko was a star in Hollywood, the Hollywood Stars of the Pacific Coast League. He was a guy who hit a lot of home runs, just not quite good enough to make it to the major leagues, although he played with some teams in the major leagues, including the St. Louis Browns and the expansion Los Angeles Angels in 1961. Phil Silvers played the character Bilko, Ernie Bilko. Nat Heineken, who did that show along with Car 54, Where Are You?, fell in love with the name Bilko, and he thought Bilko would be the perfect name for Phil Silvers, who was always trying to bilk somebody in the show, The Bilko Show, You'll Never Get Rich, or The Phil Silvers Show. Not the only baseball player who ever was immortalized in a TV show. Donna Reed, Brady Bunch, Mr. Ed, Munsters, Phil Silvers Show, also known as Bilko, some of the show's players appeared on. The other guy, well, let me get to Bob Uecker first. Must have been in the front row. Bob Uecker is in baseball's Hall of Fame as a personality in the radio and TV wing for being the Milwaukee Brewers announcer for 50 years. Bob Uecker was a catcher, backup catcher, St. Louis Cardinals, Atlanta Braves. He ended in Philadelphia Phillies. He ended up trying out a nightclub routine. Very funny guy. I've known Uecker for a long time. Very funny guy. And he's appearing in New Orleans in one of the clubs on Bourbon Street. And Al Hirt, who is the trumpet player at Chris Owens. If you know anything about New Orleans, you know about Chris Owens' bar. I actually danced at Chris Owens with her one day in 2003. Chris Owens, trumpeter, was Al Hirt. So Al Hirt's going to the clubs and he sees Bob Uecker. And he calls up Johnny Carson immediately. Hey, John, got to have this guy, Bob Uecker, on the show. Funniest guy I ever saw. And John trusted Al Hirt, gets on the show. And Johnny Carson invites him to the couch, which means you've made it after you do the routine. And Johnny leans over to him. Is it true that you're a Major League Baseball player? Johnny had no idea. And sometimes Uecker would just go on the show, sit there and talk to Johnny because he had made it. I knew another comic by the name of Wayne Cotter who was on once. Johnny called him to the couch. And some days he wouldn't even do the routine. And Wayne is a comic out there, and his agent said, don't show the clips of you and Carson because they'll think you're 142 years old. Moose Stubing was the other guy from the TV show that got his name after him, On the Love Boat, Moose Stubing. Moose, the producers, Aaron Spelling, was going through a book of baseball names, loved the name Stubing. And that's how Captain Stubing on the Love Boat became Stubing. On Broadway, damn Yankees. Well, damn Yankees didn't win last year. Washington won last year. But in the 1950s, there was the old Broadway show, or was the Broadway show, Damn Yankees. Whatever Lola wants, Lola gets. And it's a story about Joe Hardy, who sells his soul to the devil so Washington can win. Now, I don't know if anybody sold their soul to the devil last year on the Washington team. They finally won a championship for the first time since 1933. Anyway, that's Gwen Verdon, and it's the Broadway show, Damn Yankees. Jerry Lewis was in that show as well, once as the devil. Joe Hardy sells his soul so Washington can win. The other big song You gotta have heart. That song would come back, a decade and a half later. If I was standing, I'd do all this. For those of you who don't know, and you probably don't, Jerry Stiller is my cousin. And Jerry Stiller, along with Ann Mirror, were on that show about 40 times. And Ed liked Stiller and Mirror, and I once asked him, I said, about all the gyrations and everything else. And he said he did this because he needed to see what time it was, because he was paying for the hour and needed to get the commercials in. And he was the former Golden Gloves boxing announcer for the New York Daily News Golden Gloves back in the 1920s at Madison Square Garden. So you used to watch a guy who literally did a television show as a boxing ring announcer. I got time for this. I'll tell you one quick story. Jerry was telling me, Anna Marie Alberghetti was on, and Ed used to have basically segmented his show for kids, for teens, for young adults, for married couples with kids, for empty nesters and senior citizens. And Broadway was dark on Sunday nights, and Jerry was on the show, and Anna Marie Alberghetti was booked to get onto the show and sing for whatever show she was in. And Ed wasn't too happy with the crowd response. It's kind of flat. So Ed is, come on, let's hear it. Let's hear it for Ave Maria. Usually I get a laugh there. Anyway, that's the New York Mets. They win the World Series in 1969. And Ed has the amazing Mets singing. And there's my buddy Art Shamsky in the front row with the buttons on the suit. Next to him is Rocky Swoboda. He and Tug McGraw were my favorite people from those New York Mets days. Swoboda being the hippie he was in those days, along with Tug McGraw. Anyway, Ed had them on the show and celebrated the fact that the Mets won the World Series in 1969. Jerry Seinfeld and George Steinbrenner. I was around the Yankees. I was around the Yankees in the 80s and in the 90s. And George was George. Saturday Night Live. There are two parodies here I could talk about. I'll tell you this one. Saturday Night Live once had George as the host, and they did a shot with George as the Yankees, introducing catcher, George Steinbrenner. First base, George Steinbrenner. Second base, George Steinbrenner. Shortstop, George Steinbrenner. Third base, George Steinbrenner. Left field, George Steinbrenner. Center field, George Steinbrenner. Right field, George Steinbrenner. Designated hitter, George Steinbrenner. Manager, George Steinbrenner. Owner, George Steinbrenner. George was a lot. George was a very complicated guy who just wanted to be loved. But he showed it in a rather bizarre way. Anyway, he's on the Seinfeld show, and in the mid-1990s, Jerry Stiller, my cousin, played Frank Costanza, and one of the Yankees' former PR guys both told me the same thing. Larry David, who wrote all the scripts for the shows in the early 1990s, was getting some really, really, really big inside help from somebody. The inside help, George. George decided that he was going to send story ideas into Larry David, and Larry David was to crank out a show. And there were some story ideas. Among the ideas, storyline suggested by George, Missing George. Now, Missing George, George Costanza basically goes AWOL. They don't know where he is. And George Steinbrenner and has to go to Frank Costanza's house to break the news. And Jerry Stiller, the character, says, You traded Jay Buhner for Ken Phelps? Jay Buhner had a great career with the Seattle Mariners, and Phelps was a wipeout. But that was a storyline. It was based on one of George's workers in Tampa who went away for a weekend, had some questionable friends, and George thought he was in trouble with questionable friends. They had an all-points bulletin sent out in Tampa. Thanks to George, eventually the guy would come back. And that was that. A board meeting, that was moved. That was not unusual. If George liked your food, it was his food too. You like the cannolis? Where'd you get it? Let's go do the board meeting somewhere else. Different uniforms. George tried out different uniforms in Tampa for his Class A Yankee team. All became storylines in Seinfeld. George was actually on the show and didn't work out because George fancied himself as a thespian. And wasn't. They wanted George. They did not want actor George. They just wanted George. It didn't work out. And the scene's up in YouTube, and you can see why it didn't work out. Seinfeld said he actually did a scene in the show, and it was terrible. We couldn't use him. We cut him out. It wasn't funny. I don't remember exactly what went wrong with it, but it was quite an awkward situation. Keith Hernandez was also on the Seinfeld show. Keith had no idea who Jerry Seinfeld was when he was asked by his agent, "You interested in this thing?" And of course, George gets jealous because Jerry and Keith become good friends. Hernandez said when his agent Scott Boras asked him if he wanted to be on Seinfeld, he replied, "What's that?" Boras explained that they would fly him out first class, have him in a nice hotel for a week, pay him $15,000. Keith said, "Let's go," ready to play himself, and they became friends based on that show. There's an old expression, isn't used today, don't be Wally Pipped. Wally Pipp was the Yankee first baseman in the 1920s until June of 1925, when he allegedly called in, said he had a headache, couldn't play, and Lou Gehrig took his place, and took his place for about 14 years after that. There's a myth. He lost his job to Gehrig on June 2nd, 1925, because of a headache. Not exactly the way it was. Gehrig was this great, promising rookie, and they wanted to get him into the lineup, and they replaced Wally Pipp, who ended up playing with the Newark Bears in the minor leagues and actually made more money with the Newark Bears than the Yankees. The old adage was, don't call in sick because someone else will do your job and they may do it better. Cigarettes, a big part of the baseball. Big part of the baseball. Unfortunately, you probably can't see this all that well, but Babe Ruth is down in that little box looking like he's going to the electric chair, but he isn't because he's testing out the old gold cigarette in a blind cigarette comparison. Smoother and better, not a cough in the carload. Babe Ruth died of throat cancer in 1948, but he pitched old gold. ABC, always by Chesterfield. If you were an old Giants fan in the Polo Grounds, center field's fence, always by Chesterfield, ABC. And if you were in person with me, you'd be able to see this a bit better. Looks like they just knocked out a tooth and stuck cigarettes into Bucky Harris, the Yankee manager's face, or Bob Elliott, who was the MVP of the National League. Ted Williams is just holding up a pack of cigarettes. Musial looks like he's had a cigarette put in there. Joe DiMaggio, guarantee you he never paid for a cigarette. And Ewell Blackwell, Cincinnati Reds, he doesn't even have a cigarette. ABC, always milder, better tasting, and cooler smoking. I'm not sure how you spring heat into your mouth. It's cooler, but they claimed it was cooler. And Yogi, let's go back to Yogi for a minute. Yogi, Joe Garagiola and I had a relationship, and Joe was Yogi's translator. It started back on talk shows back in the late 50s, early 60s. And Joe would say to me, Yogi always stepped in it. He could find the right place to step in and make a lot of money. And Yoo-Hoo was one of those places. Mickey Mantle drank Yoo-Hoo. Moose Gowan, one of my favorite people. Love Moose Gowan. Great storyteller. Went to Arthur Murray. Casey Stengel sent him to Arthur Murray because he couldn't play shortstop. His footwork was terrible. And Casey figured, hey, you can play first base if you got some footwork. So Casey sent him to Arthur Murray. Moose told me, not only did I become the Yankee first baseman, I also was a hit with the girls. Look at me. My nickname's Moose. Look at me. And he found his wife on the dance floor, and Elston Howard. Yogi, the drink of champions. Yogi becomes wealthy because of Yoo-Hoo, which I found vile. It was drinking chocolate water. Anyway, Yogi meets the Oliveri family. They had Yoo-Hoo at a New Jersey country club in 1955. They're having all kinds of problems getting the brand distributed, and they figure, let's roll the dice. We'll ask Yogi. What do you think? He likes it. Yogi's on board. With Yogi, they're able to get distribution. Yogi's story. One time I was in the office and the phone rang with no one else around. I always answer a ringing phone, so I did. The woman who was calling asked if Yoo-Hoo was hyphenated. I said, no, ma'am, it's not even carbonated. True story. Dave Kaplan told me that. True story. Yogi sold Italian dressing. For me, it's got everything. Sure, makes swell salads. Kraft Italian dressing. Hey, I remember, I'm 64 years old, but I remember cars that I had in the 1970s that you had to put water in the battery where the battery would go. Yogi had a solution for that, the Prestolite high-level battery. Needs water only 3 times a year. That's it. Sold. And Yogi, the beer spokesman, Miller Beer. Also, Mark Throneberry was in there. I don't know why. They'd have me in this commercial and Bob Uecker, Boog Powell, among others in the Miller Lite All-Stars. Hey, want a bike? Well, we're way past Christmas, but you might want to think about this for this Christmas. This Christmas, ask mom and dad for a Shelby, a winner's bike. Yogi pitched the bike. It wasn't Schwinn. It was Shelby. Yogi was ubiquitous in the 1950s. He was everywhere. Played in the World Series every year. Well, not every year. Not 1954, not 1959, but the rest of the decade, he was there and he was on TV, and he didn't look like a baseball player. There was even a cartoon character named after him, Yogi Bear. He was on the Bilko Show, and I once said to him, and this is pure Yogi, I once said to him, what were the Yankees doing at Fort Baxter in Kansas, which is the mythical place where the Bilko Show took place? He said, no, we're in the Bronx. I said, no, Yogi, what were the Yankees going through Kansas? No, we're in the Bronx, right off the Cross Bronx Expressway. At that point, I decided, you know what? He was right. They were in the Bronx. They were just playing on the television show. So that was Yogi in the 1950s. Yogi's teammate, Joe DiMaggio. Joe DiMaggio had that marriage with Marilyn Monroe. They're at the Stork Club in this picture. Guarantee you that Joe did not pay for his cigarettes or his drinks or his meal at the Stork Club. Joe had short arms, long pockets, as Phil Rizzuto once told me, and there he is with Marilyn. And I had a friend by the name of Mark Schneider, the late Mark Schneider, who actually wrote a book about Joe, his baseball career. 330 pages, 11 pages about the relationship between Joe and Marilyn. And he, after he retired from the Associated Press, did talks about Joe and Marilyn. He passed away a couple of years ago. And I said, how'd you get 45, 50 minutes out of 11 pages? He said, the women, it was all women who came to watch this because the women loved Marilyn Monroe. The best dumb blonde ever. There was Jean Harlow before her, and there was Carole Lombard, her, and then Jane Mansfield and Mamie Van Buren, and none of them could approach Marilyn Monroe. She had a talent. She wasn't stupid, according to people who I know knew her, that she was very smart. She left Joe for Arthur Miller and was pen pals with Albert Einstein. On June 14th, 1954, DiMaggio and Marilyn eloped in San Francisco. By October 1954, Monroe filed for divorce. The only thing she said was mental cruelty. And it was that scene that ended the relationship. Joe happened to be on the set the day that the skirt blew up from the subway grate. That is in Stamford, Connecticut, 2017. The skirt, the upflip of the skirt faces a church. The parishioners who came out, the first thing they saw were Marilyn's underwear. And underneath in that picture, 7-year itch, I guess that picture was, to the Marilyn's left, there was another church. They put that statue, which is 26 feet tall and goes around the United States. Probably won't this year. Goes around the United States. It was in Chicago last year. And they put it with a church in a church. Anyway, the story is that Joe didn't particularly like what happened. And apparently he decided to get a bit physical with Marilyn, and Marilyn decided right after that to file for divorce. Among the songs, we haven't talked about songs, Mrs. Robinson, which started out in life as Mrs. Roosevelt, Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt. We didn't start the fire. That was with Joe in there. Joe DiMaggio, of course. Did you see Jackie Hit the Ball by Duke Ellington? and Mickey by Teresa Brewer. But let's get to the quintessential baseball song after Take Me Out to the Ball Game. It is Mrs. Robinson. And it is Mrs. Robinson only because of Where Did You Go, Joe DiMaggio. Now, Mrs. Robinson started out life as a 30-second or so snippet in the movie, The Graduate. And Columbia record officials, Columbia executives said, hey, we like that song. Can you lengthen it out? And Paul Simon says, yeah, I guess I can. And he decides to make the song about an American hero. And he starts with Mrs. Roosevelt, who he thinks is an American hero. And he brings the song to Mike Nichols. And Mike Nichols hears it and says, it's now Mrs. Robinson. Now, Paul, from what I've been told, said, actually, I'm going to give you the Johnny Blanchard story. Johnny Blanchard was talking about this story one day. And Johnny was a go-to guy for Roger Maris and All Stories Yankees. He was a great storyteller. He and Moose Scow, two of the best. And Johnny told me that he had heard the story from Paul about going out to dinner with Joe DiMaggio. And that we know that Joe wasn't paying, Paul was paying. And he said that Joe walks in and he's introduced to Paul Simon. And he says, what do you mean? Where did I go? I'm here. I'm sitting with you. I haven't gone anywhere. And Paul's explaining, he said, well, you know, you retired in 1951. I was 10 years old in 1951. I never saw you again. And you know, I was wondering what happened to you. He said, what do you mean, what's happened? I'm here, I'm sitting with you. I did a commercial the other day. I'm around, I haven't gone anywhere. And at that point, Paul decided it wasn't worth his while to continue on this vein of questioning that, or answering, and that they were gonna have dinner. Simon said, I said that I didn't mean the lines literally. I thought of him as an American hero and that genuine heroes were in short supply. He accepted the explanation and thanked me. We shook hands and said goodnight. Eleanor Roosevelt was one of the people he considered, along with Ted Williams, but he ended up with Joe. Dick Cavett, he's on Dick Cavett show one night on ABC, the late night show. Dick Cavett was a writer for Johnny Carson, and Johnny used to watch the show and critique him. Dick Cavett asked why Mickey Mantle's name wasn't used. Mickey Mantle didn't like the fact that Joe DiMaggio's name was used. Mickey always thought that Joe killed his career in the 1951 World Series, in that there was a fly ball hit to right center field. Mickey is very fast, and he's running there as fast as he can, and he trips over a grate, a sprinkler, and he thinks Joe is loafing, and he injures his knee, and that's the beginning of all of the knee injuries that he would have. Of course, today it'd be scoped, and he'd be back. So Mickey was never happy with the fact that Joe DiMaggio is in this hit song. And he says to Simon, he says, why'd you use him, not me? And he said, Joe DiMaggio just sounded better than Mickey Mantle. When Paul Simon put out his greatest hits videos in the Me and Julio song, Mickey Mantle and John Madden, who I worked for 15 years, are both in that video. And Mickey, though, this is how Paul Simon made it up to him, batting right-handed down at the schoolyard playing, and Mickey is in there. I work with John Madden. Quick aside there. And he comes in and he said, wait. And I said, well, what's wrong? Because if he called you by your last name, that meant he liked you. He said, I was in a rock video. Rock video? What rock video are you in? I was in with Paul Simon. He's me and Julio in the schoolyard. I said, that's not rock and roll, it's folk. Yeah, it's not rock. Oh no, it's a rock. So John thought it was a rock video. He got a gold record for that. Dick Cavett asked Mantle, why wasn't your name used? His name used? Why DiMaggio? And Simon said, it's about syllables, Dick. It's about how many beats there are. That's my old buddy, Terry Cashman. Terry Cashman and I seem to share the same periodontist in Riverdale. Terry wrote a whole series of baseball songs. He was Jim Croce's producer. Cashman and West wrote a lot of songs in the 1970s and 80s. He started doing baseball songs, including this one called Willie, Mickey, and the Duke, Talking Baseball. There was supposed to be somebody else in that picture. That guy isn't there. It was Joe D. He was airbrushed out for Willie, Mickey, and the Duke, the song that Terry Cashman wrote. That's a picture from Shea Stadium. And there is no Joe DiMaggio there. Joe should have been very upset about that. 1981 song, written and performed by Terry Cashman. He was left out of the song. Here's my old buddy, the Scooter. Phil Rizzuto, the Scooter. And Phil's in the Baseball Hall of Fame. I once asked Phil, why are you so funny? He said, I'm not funny. Okay, have it your way, Phil. Anyway, Phil gets a gold record. Meatloaf, Paradise by Dashboard Light, Bat Out of Hell album in the 1970s. And I used to see Meatloaf because he lived near me and he coached a girls softball team. And I should put a picture of him and my son in there, maybe next time. Anyway, we're talking about Paradise by the Dashboard Light and Rizzuto. And he says, Jim Steinman, who was his producer and wrote the song, said only one guy could do justice for the song, and that's Rizzuto. And it's a song about a guy and a girl, maybe in high school, maybe a bit after high school. And it's time for them to seal their relationship. And Rizzuto is brought in to just be Phil Rizzuto, play-by-play guy of this dialogue. It's about 140 takes, and they're getting really frustrated because Rizzuto is not being Rizzuto. He's trying to be, I don't know, Olivier, like George Steinbrenner on Seinfeld. Finally, they said, just be Phil. And he was, and he does the whole thing. So he gets this gold record, and one day I'm talking to Phil, and I said, where's your gold record? He says, that Huckleberry. I said, what do you mean, that Huckleberry? He said, they never told me it was about sex. I said, what? He said, my kids called me up. They said, Dad, and his kids were going to school in Boston, college in Boston at the time. He said, Dad, you know that's about sex. What do you mean, that Huckleberry? He fooled me. One quick other Phil Rizzuto story. Saturday Night Live is doing a bit in the 1970s, Chico Escuela. Baseball been very, very good to me. Ralph Kiner. Quick, I'm going to give you the quick version of the story because it's about 10 minutes long. Mets and Yankees playing in St. Petersburg, Florida. NBC sends a crew down there, and they are going to film Chico Escuela as a New York Met. And Phil walks in, and he sees Ralph Robbins sitting there with Ralph Kiner. A couple other people were there. And Rizzuto said, who's this guy, Chico Escuela? Now, Ralph Kiner's next door neighbor was Phil Harris, the band leader on the Jack Benny show, and had his own show and all that. He said, oh, you never heard about that. What? So, Casey loved him. He was going to be our first star until that unfortunate accident. Kind of goes on for 20 minutes. Meanwhile, Rizzuto has to go and do the opening for Channel 11 WPIX, and he's with Bill White. And they start the opening, and he says, yeah, it's Chico Escuela Day, and he had an injury, and Casey loved him. And Bill White looks at him, and he said, I told you that. He said, Kiner. He said, that Kiner, I'm going to go out there and kill him, because Kiner pulled his leg, and Rizzuto was going to use it for the opening of the Yankee game. So anyway, so that was Phil Rizzuto, and he did get his gold record. So he provides the play-by-play. Player is aggressive base runner, yearly gets called out a few times, eventually tries for a suicide squeeze on his way to home. He never knew it was about sex until his kid told him. I usually do this standing up, but I can't today, but I'll grab one of these. As you can see, baseball card, Topps baseball cards. I saw that sign in Columbia, South Carolina at an old junk store a couple of years ago. And I have problems with baseball cards. I really do. And it stems from the fact when I was 7 years old and the traumatic experience I had when I was 7 years old. And some of you in there may have had the same traumatic experience if you are of my age, around my age. And when baseball cards like this, baseball cards were the thing. Anyway, I'm in 3rd grade, and have my baseball cards. My baseball cards. And we're trading and doing all that other stuff. Miss Charles is my teacher. She takes my baseball cards away, takes them away, along with the other kids. Traumatic, absolutely traumatic. Left a scar. And I'm doing a talk in Roseland, New Jersey. It's about 10 years ago. And it's a senior residence, people in their late 60s, 70s, and 80s. And I'm talking, and I see a woman, as I'm talking about these slinking into her chair. And I look at her, and she looks, and I said, "Did you take my baseball cards away?" "Yeah, I had to." "Had to? You had to?" "Well, you don't understand. I was dating a guy at that point." I said, and I wanted to make an impression on his 6-year-old child. So I figured if I brought baseball cards to him, he would like me. "You stole my baseball cards?" You realize that you can get the baseball cards. I'm pointing at the baseball card picture here. You can't see that. 5 picture cards in bubble gum. By the way, my periodontist and oral surgeon, Cyberger, they love you. They made a lot of money off of me and a lot of money off of other people roughly that age from the 1950s and 60s, because when you bit into the bubble gum, you never knew if your teeth were going to last. It was hard. Anyway, I said, "You took my baseball cards?" "Yeah." I said, "What happened with the guy?" "We broke up." "And you took my baseball cards." Never gave it back. Baseball cards. Before there was the internet, the baseball cards, all about baseball, because with one of these, it could teach you how to add, subtract, multiply, or divide. Entree into gambling. Gambling, I gambled through your card like that. And if you match through your card like that, played colors. Flipped the card. Or you leaned it up against the post. It's your entree to gambling. You also did strategy. You never wanted to trade your Sandy Koufax or your Willie Mays or your Hank Aaron and Mickey and Yogi and Whitey. You didn't want to trade that. But you wanted to make trades because you wanted to complete your sets. I still have some cards from back in those days. So you learned gambling. You learned strategy as well with trades. You learned geography. Geography. Well, this guy is, actually it's Ken Griffey Jr. in this one. He's with Seattle, so you can look up Seattle. You also learned bicycle flap, or put the cards in your bicycle flap so you have the whirling sound. You add, subtract, multiply, divide because you want to know everybody's averages. And baseball cards were a big deal. They were a really big deal to kids back then. And kids also were always out back in the 60s on the field. And in 2011, I got an award from the United States Sports Academy, Daphne, Alabama. And I was down there. I was talking to the baseball coach at Southern Alabama University. And I said, just curious, do your kids really know how to play baseball? No. What we learned on the field, parents weren't around. We learned how to pick our teams. We learned how to umpire. And we learned who was good, who was bad, and make decisions on the baseball field. The coach said you couldn't do that because they didn't have the background, because they played organized baseball, Little League on up, and they didn't play by themselves, and they had families, rather fathers who were their coaches and all. So the baseball card and the baseball experience, big deals, 50s, 60s, and 70s. As we wrap up here, there really are no new songs about baseball, not much literature, and I'm going to give you a Yogi story here because you want to hear Yogi stories. Again, Dave Kaplan is the source. Back in the late 50s, Ernest Hemingway is brought down to the Yankee locker room, clubhouse, and he's introduced to all the players. And Ernest Hemingway, Yogi Berra. Yogi Berra, Ernest Hemingway. Yogi puts out his hand, said, "Hey, Ernie, what paper you work for?" Could have said Kansas City Star and would have been correct. Not really too many new movies that that have the lasting impact in the culture anymore. Baseball has become another sport. Football, took over from baseball as the #1 sport in '65. There's some people probably watching the NFL draft right now instead of me. Basketball, there were only 8 teams around. Hockey, 6 teams, 2 in Canada back then. PGA wasn't well developed. The only thing that baseball had to compete with was boxing. The heavyweight champion of the world was the king of the sports world, and that wasn't all that often. And horse racing every day with the Triple Crown races. But things changed with the advent of television. Football became #1. Baseball, which is not a good sport to watch on TV, compared to football and basketball, take over. Now, the question, anybody want to answer this? I'll give you a chance to answer it. Just put up your hand and Jim will let you answer it if you want to do it. Is Homer Simpson in baseball's Hall of Fame or not? If you want to answer that, raise your hand and Jim will open your mic.
Actually, they just have to type into the chat box, and that's how we'll do it.
Okay, okay, go ahead. You could do that. Anybody doing that? Okay, one chat. Okay.
Andrew says yes.
Okay.
I'll promote him, Jim, so he can speak. Hold on.
Yeah.
Sure.
See there?
Yes, he just has to unmute himself.
Oh, okay.
Okay, there you go.
All right. Yes or no?
Yes.
The answer is yes. 2017, Homer Simpson ended up in the Hall of Fame. The other Hall of Famers who don't come from baseball, Casey at the bat, John Fogerty, center field in 1985, League of Their Own, and of course, Abbott and Costello, who's on first. The who's on first loop is constant at Cooperstown. Who's on first was the first to go into the Hall of Fame. As I said, baseball no longer is in the center of the sports world. That guy, Joe Namath, in the Jets, 1969, winning the Super Bowl, propelled the Super Bowl into a very special place in American sports. Had the Jets not won that day, who knows how long it would have taken the Super Bowl to become the Super Bowl. The guy to my left is Bruce Morton, ABC, and the guy sitting there right behind Bruce is Weave Ewbank, who's the coach of the New York Jets. 1950, baseball, horse racing, boxing dominated American sports. By 1965, the Harris poll, football surpassed baseball as the #1 sport in popularity in the United States. This guy really couldn't say boxing. That's me and Ali, 1985. One of the last
Evan,
yeah.
Evan, I'm sorry to cut you off. You have to share your screen again to get the presentation back up.
Okay.
Yeah, I can't see it.
All right. There you go. Got it?
Yeah.
Okay, it's back. All right, so let's go back to I gotta do that. Hang on. Hold on. Why? Whoop, wrong way. There's me and Joe and Bruce Morton, Weave Ewbank. That's 1988 Wingfoot Golf Course, where this year's U.S. Open was supposed to be held in June. About a mile and a half from the first containment zone in the United States. They're not holding the U.S. Open there in June, starting on June 12th, maybe later in the year. And there's me and Ali. And Ali couldn't say boxing. Had a good run in the 1970s with it. One of the saddest things I ever saw was Ali losing to Larry Holmes. And he said to me, "You think it was sad to you, how about me?" And Larry Holmes said the same thing. Horse racing is saved by casinos today. And here in New York, Yonkers Raceway may be gone by 2021, and it just may put a hotel there, and MGM just may open a casino. There was a 10-year deal to have slot machines in Yonkers Raceway. They had to have harness racing. That may go, and harness racing may end up at the Belmont Complex in 2022. Me and Jim Bouton, about 11 years ago, Jim Bouton wrote the quintessential baseball book, Ball 4. He was nearly thrown out of baseball for it. Bowie Kuhn in 1970 called him into the commissioner's office saying, I want you to renounce that book. None of this happened in the book, including Mickey Mantle going to the roof of the Shoreham Hotel to quote unquote shoot beaver, Mickey drinking, among other things. And Mickey, of course, did beer commercials later on. Ball 4, Humanized Players, one of the most influential books of the 20th century. And I'm going to give a plug to the New York Public Library because they claimed it was one of the most influential books of the 20th century. Jim and I crossed paths a lot, spoke a lot. He passed away last year up at the Berkshires. I was hoping to have him come to one of my talks at the Berkshires, but unfortunately he had Alzheimer's and was unable to. The book used as part of the arbitration that Peter Seitz used to end the reserve clause. Soccer has come up, and that's 2015. I'm on the red carpet in Philadelphia for a premiere of a soccer movie called Sons of Ben. Baseball now competes with soccer for young players on the field. You see more soccer fields at the World's Fairgrounds in Flushing Meadows than you see baseball fields today, which years ago would have been totally unheard of. Now, Mike Dyer is not on the call. I was hoping he would be on the call because he would have been much better to tell this story about Yogi Berra than me. What is Yogi Berra's most famous saying? It ain't over until it's over. Now, you're probably expecting this huge story about how Mike got Yogi to say it ain't over till it's over. This is going to be a letdown for you. Late 1973, New York Mets. They're not first place. They've been in pretty much last place most of the year because most of their players were injured. But all the players came back for September, and Chicago never opened up enough of a lead to pull away from anybody, and the Mets got hot. But the Mets lost a couple of games, and the mathematics was against it. And Mike Dyer was working for the Long Island Press at the time. And Mike, afterwards, there's a scrum with the manager where all the reporters are around. And Mike Dyer says to Yogi, looks at him, well, is it over? And Yogi said, it ain't over till it's over. Ain't over yet. I'm going to give you a couple of Yogi stories here. Hey, if you see a fork in the road, you take it. Nobody goes to that restaurant anymore. Talking about a restaurant in Minneapolis. Nobody goes to that restaurant anymore. It was too crowded. Ain't over until it's over. Ain't over until it's over. Yogi Berra is the most quoted man in the history of the Supreme Court since day one with John Jay, because it ain't over until it's over. Joe Garagiola once said to me, Yogi had broken English. It was all broken English because he thought in Italian, because he didn't learn English till he's 5 years old, and it came out in English. Joe said that Yogi was one of the smartest guys around. Joe was the second best baseball player on his block. He said, if you think Yogi was funny, you should have met his brother Lefty. Going to give you a Yogi story. It's a non-political story. If you took out the names, you'd probably be better off, but I'm going to give you the story anyway. It's a non-political story. 2008, Joe Torre has a fundraiser, Trump National Country Club, up in Westchester County. And it's a who's who that show up there. Bill Clinton is there. Rudy Giuliani is there. Billy Crystal, the actor, is there. Ari Fleischer is there. Michael Bloomberg is there. Donald Trump is there. Okay, whole bunch of people. Forget the names, forget the ideology, forget it all. Forget that all. Just, these are famous people. And they're all there. And I'm in the corner. Rudy Giuliani is just yakking my ear off about the 2008 election, and it's 48-48. We got to go after the 4% and all that other stuff. He's just yakking my ear off. Then all of a sudden, Billy Crystal announces, in this Howard Cosell voice, ladies and gentlemen, Yogi is on the premises. You've never seen guys 63, 64 years old move as fast as they did. What happened? Where's Rudy? Gone. I'm coming, Bill Clinton, I'm coming, with his 3 bodyguards, Secret Service people. Michael Bloomberg, gotta go, with his plainclothes guys. Donald Trump, I'm going, with Keith Schiller, his bodyguard. So they were all there. And I go outside, wave to Yogi. I think it's fine. Now, what I used to do with Yogi when he was alive, instead of taking people out to dinner or out to lunch in New York, I took him to see Yogi. Ted Fay, come see Yogi. My wife's cousin, come see Yogi. I never told them where we were going till we got there. And they said, Yogi Berra Museum, why are we here? I said, just shut up. I go in the back door. Yogi, I want you to meet my cousin. I want you to meet my friend. They were in awe. They were in absolute awe that I did it with Yogi. Anyway, so I go down to the museum and just say hello. And he looks at me and says, I'm mad at you. Mad at me? Mad at me for it. I'm mad at you. He said, you saw me the other day. I said, yeah. He said, you don't come over and say hello like a friend? Now, this is my Paul Simon moment. I'm thinking to myself, Clinton's got 3 bodyguards. Bloomberg's got 2 plainclothes cops. Donald Trump has Keith Schiller. There is security there anyway, and they're all around Yogi. And there's no way I'm going to go close to them because Bill Clinton is chewing on his left leg. Donald Trump's chewing on his right arm. Giuliani is throwing himself at him. So is Billy Crystal. So is Ari Fleischer and a whole host of others. You know, and just this Yogi. I said, and he says, no, I want to tell you something. He says, if you're a friend, no matter what, you come over and say hello. With that, it ain't over till it's over. That's Brian Cashman, the Yankee general manager. That, of course, is Yogi. That's 2011. That is me at the Yogi Berra Museum. Brian and I were on stage apart. I followed Brian that day with Yogi. It was the last time Yogi saw me speak. And I miss him because every time I went to the museum, he made me feel at home. And Yogi, after every talk, used to come up to me, he'd pat me on the back and say the same thing. Good job, kid. Good job. With it, it ain't over till it's over, but it's over. Any questions or comments? Gotta find the comment.
Anyone with any questions?
Any questions? Any comments? Thank you, Mike.
There you go.
Thank you, Mike. I hope everybody enjoyed it, and hopefully we could do this again in person one of these days. And hopefully everybody stays safe, and hopefully we get out of this one of these days so I can actually physically be there in the library and enjoy your company, because I do like going back and forth and all. So thank you, Jim, for inviting me.
Thank you so much.
I appreciate that. And thank you for everybody who listened to the hour and a half. And I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you had a couple laughs out of it, and hope that you learned that Take Me Out to the Ball Game might have been the first women's lib song ever written by 2 men. I didn't mention that both Norwith and Von Tilzer are in the Songwriters Hall of Fame. They wrote a whole bunch of other songs, but they're most famous for Take Me Out to the Ball Game. And so that's what they're most famous for. But anyway, thank you so much. And hopefully hopefully we can do this again.
Thanks so much.
Thanks,
And
everybody.
if anyone wants to check our Facebook, we'll have a listing of upcoming programs. And if you have any questions, let us know.
Yeah, and you could direct questions to me, and I'm going to be, I don't know when I'm going to be on again. I know I'm doing a private presentation for Florida International University on May 11th. And, but I have my website.
Okay. If anybody has any questions, they can contact us, and we can absolutely contact you.
Okay. Okay,
Thank you so much.
okay, we'll talk to you soon then.
Thanks, Evan.
Appreciate it.
Okay, take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.